Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Jennings. I'm director of the Christian Regenhard Center for Emergency Response Studies here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And I'd like to welcome you and thank you for attending our final spring 2023 seminar for the center. For those of you who do not normally attend, we hold these events monthly during the academic year, and we have a range of subjects related broadly to the issues of emergency response. And we're very pleased to have today's speaker, Bob Hennelly. A lot of times in the business that we're in, if you come up through the technical side of the house, politics is viewed as kind of a dirty word, and there's some attempt a lot by the professions to pretend it doesn't exist, when in reality it does, and we're all influenced by it and try to influence it. And so our speaker today is obviously, well, not obviously, it will be obvious in a minute, is extremely well qualified to discuss that, and that's Bob Hennelly. Bob is an award-winning independent journalist. He focuses on labor, public health, public safety, occupational health, the economy, and the environment. He's a regular contributor to Salon, Work Bites, Insider New Jersey, and The Village Voice. He's also a veteran broadcast journalist who's worked for NPR, WNYC, WBGO. For those of you who aren't hip to that, that's a great NPR jazz station in Newark. He's also worked as a TV reporter for WPIX. He's worked for CBS Money Watch and CBS's 60 Minutes. Many of you in the public sector may know him from his writing for The Chief Leader, where he was there for many years, focusing on the FDNY, the MTA, as well as federal civil service. Through the pandemic, he's focused on issues of frontline first responders, healthcare professionals, and transport sector workers. Bob's other work experiences in demolition, construction, loss prevention, agriculture, nonprofit management, as well as union and public administration help inform his reporting. He hosts a weekly radio program on WBAI that focuses entirely on the issues of working people. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Detroit Free Press, The Guardian, Christian Science Monitor, and dozens of other news outlets. He's the author also of a recent book called Stuck Nation: Can the U.S. Change the Course of Its History of Choosing Profits Over People? Which a title, by the way, Bob, that only an academic would come up with. And so the last plug before I forget is your show on WBAI. I'm not an early riser, thankfully, as a
7 a.m. Right.
7 a.m.
Yeah.
But it is worth getting up for, and it is actually preserved on the webpage. Right. So you can go in at a civilized 10 o'clock and
or whenever
see what Bob was up to that day. So with that, I want to welcome you, Bob, and turn it over to you. And you've got some kind of opening remarks, and then we'll have some back and forth.
Right. And Charles, what a great honor. I mean, I'm Christian Regenhard is no abstraction to me. And Sally Regenhard and the entire 9/11 World Trade Center community, I've been privileged to be involved with in the years since. Much of Stuck Nation, actually, its structure looks at labor rights and the role of collective action by unions from the Triangle Fire right on through COVID, and the importance of people acting in the common interest together collectively to protect themselves and their families in the broader community. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the media landscape that we're in now, because as people that are concerned with public safety, that's something we have to be aware of. How do we know what we know? That may seem awfully simplistic, and yet it's perhaps the most foundational question we can ask, because it's the first step in authenticating information that command decisions, and yes, even lives, can depend on. News is, after all, the basis for the public's situational awareness. Their sense of risk or potential danger is framed through the prism of whatever news source they choose through which to see the world they live in. In just the last 3 years, we've seen our national public health response to a once-in-a-century mass death event fractured by competing narratives about the COVID virus. Rest assured, as experts and PhD candidates are churning through the excess mortality data zip code by zip code for COVID, they are studying the role that information played in how the pandemic played out. On January 6th, for the first time in the history of our republic, the peaceful transition of presidential power that happens months after the general election was marred by mob violence in the Capitol. Yet another example of what can happen when we don't share a common news narrative about which presidential candidate actually won an election. So in order to navigate this fractured media environment, it's important to understand how it came to be. Let me offer my lived experience. It's, after all, how I know what I know. Close to a half century ago, I started as a part-time reporter for the Ramsey Maurer Reporter in Northwest Bergen County. I was still in high school and got paid 10 cents a column, inch, and $5 if I took a photo. At the time, even in these sleepy suburban communities where I covered the town council, school board, meetings where, there'd be 2, sometimes 3 other reporters who were grown-ups with family obligations who are making their full-time living reporting on local news. This meant that they would stop by the local police station, would actually go out and cover fires. Similarly, in the county seat and state capitals across this nation, there were thousands and thousands of reporters just like me covering meetings and doing investigative reporting. Over the last 20 years, that workforce has been decimated and is a shadow of its former self, as local newspapers have been bought up by Wall Street-oriented conglomerates like Gannett, which owns 1 in 5 of America's local newspapers. According to the University of North Carolina's Hussman School of Journalism and Media, their report, Expanding News Desert, since 2004, our nation has lost 1,800 newspapers, including more than 60 dailies and 1,700 weeklies. Regardless of the corporate actor, the play is always the same. Sell off the physical real estate, which usually includes a printing plant as well as a newsroom. Who needs a printing plant? They lay off as much news staff as possible. Now, meanwhile, the same thing was happening in local TV and radio stations as the Congress deregulated the broadcast industry, paving the way for the advent of mega corporations like Fox News. Having formerly locally owned newspapers, TV and radio stations be subsumed by corporate behemoths from nowhere in particular would profoundly alter the news landscape to the public's disadvantage. Consider the example of a dear colleague of mine who was a news director for a family-owned Jersey Shore radio station, top 40. They had a robust newsroom, which he built with several reporters covering the local community. When it was brought by a national chain, the reporters were all fired, including my friend. A devoted listener called up my friend who had left his job as news director to complain because the radio station hadn't warned the area about a tornado because the station was broadcasting the weather for Southern California. You see the civil defense linkage here? Lack of local reporting. Simultaneous with local news media outlets were increasingly consolidated. Unauthenticated social media aggregated into free content filled the void left by the death of authenticated local and regional news. Twitter and Facebook became the way an increasing number of Americans got their news, which was being fed to them based on their prior personal use data analytics. Talk about a feedback loop. Whether it be a once-in-a-lifetime mass death event or the challenges posed by the climate crisis, a well-informed population clued into the actual local conditions around them is the essential foundation of a durable civil defense. It's not political. It's about people getting through a difficult challenge with the same playbook, understanding what challenges they face, what challenges their first responders face, so they'll cooperate and be helpful. So that's a quick look under the hood of the 21st century news universe that I currently work in. So how are the catastrophic mass casualty events reported in this environment? One journalism axiom that seems to have endured is, if it bleeds, it leads. Historically, events like a mass casualty fire can have a galvanizing impact on the political economy they happen in. Consider the Triangle Fire in Lower Manhattan on March 25th, 1911, which claimed the lives of 146 mostly young immigrant female garment workers. The catastrophic fire and the subsequent investigation which revealed exits had been locked, brought global attention to the sweatshop conditions in New York City's garment industry. Ironically, 16 months earlier, 20,000 mostly female garment workers had made labor history when they went out on strike for 4 months and emerged with recognition of their union, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, as well as a 20% raise. Triangle factory owners Max Blank and Isaac Harris were anti-union holdouts to what had been a widely accepted deal by the other garment manufacturers. Blank and Harris were tried twice for manslaughter, but were acquitted. Subsequent civil lawsuits on behalf of the surviving families paid out roughly $75 per victim, several of whom were only 14 years old at the time of their death. Deeper research raises questions about the owners of the Triangle factory actually employing off-duty police officers to harass suspected labor organizers. While new laws were created in the aftermath of the catastrophic fire, there was no law enforcement of the laws that were already on the books at the time. While the owners took the judgment of history, the public officials responsible for lax code enforcement had let conditions like the ones at the Triangle factory building become all too common citywide. Were they paid to look the other way, or was it municipal government promoting commerce? A combination of both. If a question of whose point of view is informing the narrative, is the person who lost a loved one, are they telling the story? Is it the firefighter who finds a body? Is it the elected official trying to deflect blame, or a candidate looking to get traction with an issue? Scroll forward over 100 years to the January 2022 Twin Parks high-rise fire in the Bronx that killed 17 residents, including 8 children. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, FDNY Commissioner Nigro said it was primarily the failure of residents to close their apartment doors that drove the death toll. Fair enough. As time passed, however, additional facts emerged about the lapsed inspections, the general state of disrepair of the building that led to the widespread use of marginal space heaters. There were jurisdictional issues about just which agency was responsible for enforcement. There was the fact that one of the owners of the building was a donor to Mayor Adams' campaign and served on his transition team, which is not of itself central to the fire, but is just another example of the sway of the real estate industry with every level of our government through their campaign donations. Just a real-world reality that we all have to deal with. And then there's the issue of the fire engine staffing itself. Consider the admission by FDNY's acting chief of department, John Hodgins, that was prompted by a line of questioning at a city council meeting. And it was at that meeting that he explained that they had normally maybe had 5 firefighters on an engine, but a certain work rule had been tripped and they had 4. And so this is just another angle of the story. Again, it goes back to whose point of view is telling the story. Is it the people that are doing the work? Is it the people supervising them? Or is it the elected people of government who are trying to take responsibility or credit for either deflect blame or to accept responsibility for a job well done? And so what ends up happening is we get this kind of tabloid sensation for the initial coverage. And yet we don't see the follow through because of a diminished landscape. A New York City that does not have the number of daily papers that it used to have. And by standards, it has a better environment than most, but it considerably degraded from when I started. And so if you don't have a robust media environment where people are aggressively competing for new information and the accuracy of that information, you find yourself open to, as I said, this social media environment where it's not a question of authenticate information. It's the amount of things that are getting clicks. And as has been disclosed by these social media platforms, they even got to a point where they knew from their research that certain kinds of content would engender conflict, which they promoted because it drove traffic. So if you're a public safety individual trying to operate in this environment, you have to be aware of the fact that these are the dystopian realities about the information ecology that you are trying to perform your job in. It's also very important to go back and look at this question of point of view and narrative. one of the things that I saw firsthand during the pandemic was the focus was the hospitals. And that was because the elected officials, whether it be Governor Cuomo, Governor Murphy, had made the focus what was happening inside the hospitals. But when I went about reporting it, I was reaching out not for the political leadership that was trying to deal with this disaster, but with the actual workers doing the work. So that meant reaching out to the people that were from DC 37 union that represents the medical legal investigators, whose responsibility it is to go into an environment and make some estimation of what happened, what was the cause of death, to talk with the detectives who have, as you may know, if you're on the job, you know, their responsibility is to go into an area of undetermined cause of death and get some sense of it and secure the body. The EMS people. I reached out to every single union and spoke to people doing that work. And what I found was that their experience was very much different than what we were hearing on the TV. And they had a key piece of the puzzle. They were noticing that individuals were going to the hospital, getting treated, being reported on when they left as a success story, and then going home to die from COVID. And that feedback loop was not making its way into any of the ways that the governors were framing what was going on. Their situational awareness was framed only by their own agenda. Now, I don't want to second guess anybody with that awesome responsibility, but in terms of after action, it's important to look back and see what was it that these folks were saying that were doing the work that maybe we should have listened to earlier. One of the things that I heard from FDNY EMS Local 2507 and Officers 3621 was that they were going into households where they were all of a sudden, because of that special order that was put in place, you may be aware of the fact that because of the crisis, the state authorities that set the ground rules for EMS basically said, if you can't revive somebody in the field, don't bring them to the hospital. Well, one of the things that the suits hadn't accounted for was that changed the entire dynamic. Historically, when you have an elder who has a heart attack or anybody and their family surrounds them, you can at least continue to work on them and in many cases bring them back. We know they have that wonderful brunch, at least before the pandemic, they did to celebrate those occasions when that happens. But it also has another positive effect in that you're moving the theater of action away from the home, and it's happening at the hospital, and you're suspending the bad news for a little bit, but that's critical. And so one of the things that was happening is all of a sudden EMS found themselves with these emotional situations that hadn't been anticipated. Similarly, they were not extracting information, and they didn't have a way of feeding back information to the folks who were in the command structure about what they were dealing with, because it was, of course, a chaotic situation. But on reflection, they were saying, you know what, if we really want to beat this disease, the place we have to fight it is not just in the hospital, but in the community. They were saying this 2 months into the pandemic. They were years ahead of the folks who were in command and control. And so the failure to have that feedback loop from the people doing the work, taking the risk, I believe added to the body count. Similarly, brothers and sisters working for the MTA, TW Local 100, January, February, these people, for some reason, there's an assumption that working people are not well read. Indeed, these people were reading their Financial Times. They knew that there was a global pandemic. They started wearing masks. And so what happened? What was the response of management? Oh, don't wear that mask. That's going to scare the customers. We have to save the masks because we're short of supply. And so that's a case where working people had a common sense response, which was then suspended by people trying to manage the situation. And we know what the subsequent death toll was from that. Over 100 TW Local 100 members passed and made the ultimate sacrifice to keep society functioning. Similarly, when we look at what was happening with nurses, uh, that's why I'm so concerned about the disconnect between the experience of committed professionals in emergency services, in healthcare, and in transit, where their lived experience tells them what is a common sense response, and yet it's ignored. Case in point would be the nurses. Very early on, around February, the CDC came out with a directive that the N95 mask, which everybody knows when you do your clinical training, that you have to dispose of it after each clinical encounter. Oh no, the CDC says we've got a shortage. We want you to adopt that as a pet and bring it back and forth to lunch in your brown paper bag. And so at the time, the nurses predicted that because of that, they themselves would experience infection, they would die, and the hospitals, like Elmhurst, would become a vector for the infection. And the failure to listen to what working people were saying, committed professionals, I believe resulted in a situation where we have 4% of the world's population and 12% of the COVID deaths. I think you have to look at that and say, we need an after action report, but part of it was driven by the fact that working people who do this work professionally were not sufficiently at the table. And it began to be something where people were managing it for political outcomes. And that, with this media environment that was so badly fractured, fed a situation where our response became tribal and not holistic. And I think that now, as we go forward, we're going to see that what does endure is this fractured information environment. And so, as folks that are involved, may find themselves involved with interacting with the media, I think there's some crucial ways that you can choose to deal with the media when you're encountered in a position of course, you always want to make sure that you have whatever cover you have from the hierarchy before you speak with a reporter. But I think it's also important to kind of feel confident to actually test them a bit. And so one of the things that I always do, and I tell folks that I advise, what you should do is with your first interaction with a reporter, you should say, we don't know each other yet. One, are you taping this phone call? And sometimes that may actually be a preferable thing to make sure that there's a common record. But if they're not, you will say, well, let's get to know each other a bit. I'm not saying anything on the record until I agree to do so. And then after you give your first online or something that you want attributed to you, ask the reporter to read it back. And any reporter with their thoughts should be willing to do that, because ultimately you don't have to find yourself being used by a reporter who has an agenda. And it's really important for people that are, I think also, it's important for you as someone that has an involvement with, whether it be law enforcement, public safety, fire safety, to be assertive in general when you see things that are reported that in some ways don't take into account this essential role of the first responder. That is crucial. One of the things that, and you should assert it, and you should do what you can to make sure that that perspective is part of the story. One of the things that we saw right in the immediate aftermath of the recent East Palestine disaster, and I wrote about this a lot at Work Bites and Salon, and I think we did have some impact on the national conversation. In the first few days after that disaster, the voices in the narrative were driven entirely by the state agencies and the officials and the elected officials, whether it be Governor Shapiro or Governor DeWine, because it was in Pennsylvania and Ohio. What was absent from the conversation was the voice and perspective of labor. And when I say that, I mean a broad definition, not just where the railroaders excluded from that conversation, but also the volunteer firefighters who in East Palestine's situation, it was their obligation to go out there and fight the fire. And so by raising that, I focused my reporting, reached out for the fire unions. And what emerged was the fact that there was like two responses that went on there. There was no unified command. And the railroad really took advantage and put the first responders in the position where they had to react to the decisions that the railroad experts were making in real time. For instance, they were told, the first responder team, unified command was told they were going to detonate one vinyl chloride car. The railroad decided to do 5. So it's important to capture that narrative so that people understand that it's not just some kind of accident, like something like a weather condition, but that choices we make and choices we have failed to make set the stage for something like a disaster like East Palestine. And one of the things that's also important is that, in New York City, our experience is instructive to the rest of the country. And one of the things that happened early on was there was tremendous public skepticism about the comments by the agencies like the EPA and state environmental agencies that everything was fine in the environment. And part of that had to do with the dissonance of like 3,000 fish showing up dead within the first 24 hours of the action. But also there was this residual skepticism about official pronouncements. And what was instructive to me is remembering back to the 9/11 World Trade Center and the representations made by the EPA, well documented in the 2003 Inspector General report by the EPA, which showed that Christy Todd Whitman's comments were driven by things external to the actual environmental conditions there, like keeping Wall Street open, and that as a consequence of saying the air was safe to breathe, we're now in a world where more people have died from their occupational exposure than died on the day of the attack. And so the EPA's failure to understand that kind of inconsistency lingers. And so that's why it's important to hold government accountable, because I submit to you that a lot of the skepticism related to the COVID response is particularly in New York City's first responder community was related to that lived experience. So that's what I've got so far. I'm willing to take questions. I have a whole bunch of other scenarios to talk about. I think we've covered some ground.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground. That was a 28-minute masterclass there, Bob. So thank you for all that. So there's a couple things before we move on from that, because I think it's important that you brought out the whole, as I teach a class that, and part of the class, we do a unit on risk communication, and I show network news coverage from 3 Mile Island, which for those of you, it's ancient history. It was back in the Carter administration,
or prehistory.
Well, yes, but that was back in the day of the big 3 networks, right? When everybody in America stopped what you were doing at 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock. At 6 o'clock, you'd watch the local news for a half hour or whatever it was, and then everybody would watch one of 3 national newscasts. And it was striking, how far we've come. Both the whole issue of, the 24-hour channels, which just have to fill space, even when there's nothing new. They just, repeat stuff. But the distinct perspectives that you get, and then this influence of social media, and we look at how things have really, fragmented. And even with COVID, we've got a large group, of emergency responders who are basically, opposed to mandates for the vaccine, and some for reasons of, labor rights, some for reasons of whatever. But you've got that. Then you've got people, to this day are trying to say that, oh, well, masking doesn't really make a difference with COVID. And it's just, to me, it's just, my gosh, you've got on active shooter events, you've got now people claiming that they're, reenactors, that it's not a real, it didn't happen. how, and then you make that connection to emergency preparedness and public warning. I'm really concerned as New York has probably got it less, we're much better off than a lot of parts of the country.
Right.
But in other places where, where does this stop? Right. People like, the Weather Service is some kind of a, global conspiracy, and tornado warnings are some kind of a plot. And I'm going to exercise my constitutional right to, sit out on my back patio when the tornado comes. I mean, where does it end?
Well, I would say that it's funny because over the arc of my career, and when I had the privilege and honor to work with Ed Bradley, I remember I worked as a segment producer and reporter on a few things. And one of the lines the senior producers would say, well, we're going to have 40 million households knocking on your door to talk about that big tent you reference, right? Mm-hmm. That you were coming to whatever investigation with the robustness of the entire nation. Mm-hmm. And so there has been a fracturing of the media space in the big tent. And part of that has to do with the fact that there is this idea of that we used to have this notion that you had to be like current events, that every citizen had an obligation to be well informed. And so part of that is a degradation of civics education in school, the de-emphasis of things like history, and we can't even get consensus about what history to teach. And so one of the things that is a byproduct of that is that it's in this media market. If you want to watch Martha Stewart 24/7 and watch yet another way to fold a napkin, by George, you can have that. And you can stay in that bubble and even avoid Amber Alerts. So that polity has shrunk and become fractured. On top of that, we have major media organizations, and I include MSNBC and Fox as kind of representing maybe different political points of view, but the machine runs the same, which is that they're telling you things based on your prior audience choices that fit into the narrative you already have. So that has created a situation where it's accentuated the differences and created this parallel universe where people can experience the same event and have two totally different realities. Now, that means that when you're in an emergency situation where you have to get the buy-in from the public, you have to really work very hard to make sure you're acting on authenticated information, because nothing is worse than being in a middle management emergency situation where you're acting on bad info. So that means that you have to say, so where'd you see that? And be able to look for indicia that means that it has not actually been something that checks out.
Yeah, and there was some talk about that earlier on a few years ago, mainly in the context of adversarial misinformation. But now it's just because I'm on Twitter, usually for worse, sometimes for better.
Right.
And I've noticed almost any time there's a kind of a breaking disaster or mass casualty event, that there is phony content that comes over Twitter, and it would be a photograph of a previous event, that may have been 3 or 4 years ago, and they'll just throw up a photo of bodies on a sidewalk and say, here's from Kentucky this afternoon.
Well, part of that, and so when I was working, when I started my first daily news job was at the Hudson Dispatch, which was a scrappy blue collar paper I covered from Fort Lee to Bayonne. And I was the 4 to 12 guy. So that meant that if they came up short, I had to go find news. It's also when weird stuff happened. And so what I did with that job was I actually would try to go to every police station. I would try to make sure that I checked in as much as I can. And so the loss of that...
You go in and look at the blotter.
Right.
And which was a record of everything. Everybody got locked up. Every call would be there.
Right. Well, and the weird thing, though, is in certain communities, they also had, this annoyed me, no major activity.
Uh-huh.
So I started breaking the hole a little, riding around with the police radio in Bergen County. That did not endear me. Uh-huh. So when they take a stiff out of a hotel on Route 17, I drive up and say, is this tomorrow's no major activity?
Yeah. Okay, we've got a couple of questions and we've got a
Great.
lot of content, but we've got a small group. So let's just go ahead and you can ask the question, just keep your video off. And Catherine, you were in line first. So Catherine, if you want to have a question for Bob. Okay, Bob Till, you go ahead and we'll get to Catherine in a minute.
Hi, Bob.
Hi.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. How do you think we walk this back? I mean, in terms of news as entertainment. I think maybe it was during the Reagan administration where news started to get ratings, Nielsen ratings. It never got Nielsen ratings before that. So once it got Nielsen, that was the slippery slope in my mind. And maybe I have the time wrong. You definitely know better than I, but it's an interesting problem. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, so I would say that one of the things that happened was there was a shift, and you're right, you track it to Ronald Reagan in the sense that when cable came along, there came to be a certain shift in the policy surrounding broadcast licenses. So forever and a day, leading up until I say like the 1980s, the idea of a broadcast license was considered a privilege. And it's a matter of a point of law now. The broadcast airways belong to the public. Okay. So it's important to understand that a license to broadcast was considered to be something that they bestowed the public, the FCC, on behalf of the public, bestowed that license upon you to act in good faith. And here's a funny thing. There's actually a morals clause to be of good character, to maintain that broadcast license. Over time, as these broadcast entities grew bigger and bigger and turned into multinational corporations, and cable was able to go, and behemoths were able to go and buy up local TV stations, it became that the idea of a broadcast license was a property right. The whole thing shifted. It was looked at by the courts and indeed by policymakers as you own that station. Once that happened, where the ground began to slip. At one time, a lot of people made a living in the public affairs department of a broadcast TV or radio station. And this wasn't like public radio, like we had WNYC, places I've worked, BGO. This was just every broadcast license had an obligation for a certain amount of public affairs programming and also a certain amount of local news coverage. And as someone who's been one of my lost youth, a station program director, you filled out reports. You had to actually fill in how many hours, who was doing this. So you may remember local news would have, and yes, they would put it on the non-revenue producing gosh awful times at like before sermonette at 6 a.m. There'd be the public affairs program. But there was this space where issues could be discussed in the public interest. And so now somehow we've permitted the standard to slip. So that's become a brand. So like public radio is like this little ghetto, when in reality, the entire medium should be required to have that same threshold. Similarly with equal time. At one time, you couldn't go and have the station become the total provenance of one particular ideological base. And now look what we have. So I would suggest getting it back in the box is a matter of just enforcing the law and as consumers demanding that they act in the public interest and to return to the standard that was really the law of the land forever, which is that a broadcast license is a privilege. And I would actually extend that because for some reason they decided in a very convoluted way, and this has happened in Clinton in the 1990s, that cable was a different animal. You probably hear this a lot. Well, social media, it's a different animal. Twitter, it's not quite, and so they have not put on these entities that really are utilities the same level of accountability that should be required when you're making, one, that kind of money, and two, having that kind of effect on public safety.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting to hear you talk about that.
Just going back to East Palestine, and I think you did a great job for that. And so, you shifted that narrative, and I think very rightly so. The kind of the railroad industry, and I had not followed it. I casually was aware of the labor issues where the Biden administration basically went in and imposed an agreement. But this whole notion of really long trains, and they don't want to staff anybody on the trains. And the trains, I don't know, how long they can be, but it's crazy. But the thing that struck me, I don't know if you saw this piece from ProPublica, I think last week, there's parts of the country where these freight trains will just stop in the middle of a town
and sever the town.
Yeah, and then kids can't get to school, and you've got literally elementary school kids crawling under trains to go to class in the morning and to come back. And the train, there's no guarantee that the train won't move, and one of these kids could get sliced in half.
So this is and this is the third worldization of America's corridor community. So let's talk a little bit about what's been happening in railroading. Another job that I had was I was a crew caller for the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad. It went out of business. It's not my fault. My dad worked for the railroad. And so one of the things that has been happening is in the 1980s, there was roughly 47 Class 1 railroads. That's major, substantial organizations with rolling stock in multiple states. It's now 7. And so what's happened is the political economy, and that's a word I use a lot, of the railroading industry now replicates the very same abusive concentration of ownership that Teddy Roosevelt so successfully tried and did bust up. So in the time when we were living our lives, struggling to make a living and getting by, they have reconstituted themselves into these behemoths. And so part of that is that Wall Street has financialized that transportation sector to such a degree that they were looking for rate of return that could only be achieved by pummeling the workforce into the ground. And so one of the ways that they achieved that was to create something called precision schedule railroading. Imagine this is the equivalent to what we know happens in Amazon warehouses, where there's a certain amount of time to go to the bathroom, where human beings are treated like machines, and when they break down, they throw them away. That's kind of how America let its railroads be run. And it's instructive to know that railroads started, and it's to some degree brought out in stagnation. They really had a leg up. They enjoy a very special place in America's history because they only came to be on the scale they were because we gave them the land that we seized and stole from the Indians at a point of a gun. So if you can't have a profitable business model when you start with that kind of basis, and so it's all been looking back at this now, they are in a situation where they treat corridor communities, doesn't matter who you voted for, Trump, Biden, doesn't matter. They treat them as disposable. And they run through these 2-mile long trains. They were trying to get by with having a single engineer and maybe a conductor. And eventually East Palestine blew that up. But it's important to know that this was ruminating back in 2014 in Quebec. La Manatique was a village that was up in Quebec. And one of these situations, it was a very long, crude, Blanken crude, Bakken crude train. And it was one of these situations where they thought they could have one engineer. The engineer ran out of time, so had to park the engine. And he didn't have anybody to relieve him. He parked it. There was a fire. He wasn't there. He was getting some 40 winks. Local fire department comes, puts out the fire, and inadvertently releases the air brakes. And that puppy rolled down the mountain and incinerated the village. So that should have been a moment, don't you think? But yet, we didn't really hear about that. In railroad circles, it was clear. But that's kind of the kind of things that happen, and there's not a connection. Similarly, I will say to you, one of the things that East Palestine begs for is a national conversation, that it might be time for America to put on its big boy pants and have professional firefighters and EMS in corridor communities. If we're going to have vinyl chloride caravans going through communities, dear Jesus, let's make sure that every firefighter and every railroad worker has a self-contained respiratory device. Do you think we could do that? Sorry, this gets me agitated.
Well, yes, excellent point. And the railroads are profitable, right? This is not a struggling industry. Yeah, absolutely. And that brought up some issues. There is a National Disaster Safety Board legislation that was introduced. I don't know. I don't think anything is happening in the House right now, but that was proposed. Certainly the center here, one of the first things we did was propose that a portion of any federally declared disaster goes to an independent third party after action analysis.
Right. Good idea.
This speaks to it, and the fact that we still don't have it. But absolutely, and we actually, you'd be interested in knowing there's a methodology from the military that we identified, that the Army has a Center for Army Lessons Learned, and that is very much a bottom up after action process, and so that the results that you get, absolutely are unassailable because they're coming from the people on the ground, right? Is it more expensive and time consuming? Yes.
Is that what they call in the fire department a hot wash?
Well, the problem with the hot wash, not to get off on another topic.
I'm learning too, right, Professor?
Well, yes, but the hot wash almost never gets written down.
Oh.
And those lessons perish. They live in the people's heads. In fact, we talked with Vincent Dunn, retired FDNY chief,
right,
about specifically that whole issue of there's so much of that knowledge that gets lost, and we need those people writing the books. So to get back, we had just a question that came in via chat, and
right.
it was basically, let me paraphrase it. Most young people are totally dependent on social media platforms for
right.
their public affairs, their awareness. And CUNY as an example does have our ability for our students to get I don't know if it's free or significantly discounted subscriptions right. to like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. But how do we get young people engaging with kind of the real investigative, the real reporting out there, as opposed to something that's going to give them, here's what we found on TikTok. Here's a fist fight
right.
in Ohio of a clerk at a Target getting hit in the head with a bottle, and that's our public discourse.
Yeah, right. I would say that, of course, I'll do a shameless plug. Work Bites, which is the labor website, and that is Joe Maniscalco and Steve Wishnia and Tim Sherd. We are labor journalists. We are committed to talking about and reporting on the story of working people. It has national stories. It has local stories. One of the stories that we really have been digging in on is the stuff related to EMS. We did a quite lengthy investigation about this situation where we really people have no idea. People in the service know about assaults, but it is just really a serious issue. And the FDNY is only collecting a fraction of the information about the assaults that are happening, because they only look at FDNY EMS and fail to register the other agencies and the other individuals that are responding. So it's a lot of people don't know there's 4 distinct deployment models operating in the 5 boroughs: the FDNY, voluntary hospitals, private interfacilities, and community volunteers. So this had started when there was an EMS guy from Richmond University Medical Center, Tim McCauley. He got shot dealing with an unruly patient. And as it turned out, it was something that normally wouldn't get captured in the data that the FDNY is keeping. So imagine in 2018, there were 163 violent assaults, they say. And then that's jumped up in 2021 to 386. But that's only a fraction of what is going on. So that's an example where, because we're not getting actual reporting that's authenticated and looks at even what are the parameters of the metrics that we're using, we're not getting proper attention to what is really a public health emergency, which is the assault on EMS around the country.
Yeah, absolutely, Bob. And of course, we had the 5-year, I think, legal process playing out in the murder of the FDNY EMS member up in the Bronx, and thankfully there was a conviction there. But working in difficult circumstances, and that's a national problem. But we're on to we have a question here. Sally, did you have a question?
Yes, I'm just trying to enable the video.
Is this Sally?
That's actually Sally. Yeah.
Hi, Bob Hennelly. I was so happy to hear that you are really honoring the Christian Regenhard Center by this webinar today. And so far, your information is so excellent. I really want to take this opportunity to share with the other people on this webinar what an important integral role that you played in getting the truth out about what happened to this city, what happened to the uniformed services who had to respond to the World Trade Center. Your articles in the Chief, and of course your articles now, were so essential to getting the word out, because everything that you've said regarding the Twin Parks, regarding the railroad disaster, any disaster, when the official talking heads of government, they're the only people that are giving the public information. And it's always the advocacy groups, people like you, who did so much for us, that it gives us information to the public. Back in the day of 9/11, the public believed what they read in the paper and what they saw on TV. Of course, some people believe in the official story, but there's always another story. So Bob, I can't wait to read your book. I want to thank you for everything that you have done for the working person, especially the uniformed services, but all unionized people or all workers in general. There are far too few voices out there, and I really, really want to thank you for that.
Wow, I am just so moved. And we haven't seen each other in a long time. Sometimes I do give you a ring, but
yes, definitely. We definitely have to get together. Right now, I'd like to ask, and you mentioned the Air and Christy Whitman. I attended that congressional hearing. I was one of the people who really advocated for it. We had so much hope for that hearing. But instead of a real hearing that put this woman on the line to hold her accountable and responsible, the panel threw her softballs.
Right.
Okay. It was so frustrating, and it was just one big love fest, and we were so outraged by it. So that's the system for you. I'm sorry if there's any politicians listening to this about it, because they don't things like this, but getting the official word is a very flawed way of finding out what is going on. Your articles, everything that you did, you really helped us. And I just want to say on that point, regarding 9/11 and regarding getting out the facts to the public, there's 5 people who are responsible for helping us. Certainly Glenn and Charles from John Jay.
Yeah.
Wonderful civil rights attorney, Norman Siegel.
Yay, Norman.
And certainly yourself and Vinnie Dunn. These are people that all contributed in their own unique way. And I want to thank you so much for that. Finally, I don't need to hog this. I want to ask you about an issue that is so critical to labor, to anyone who's in a union who works for the city of New York. For example, my husband was on the NYPD for 40 years.
Right.
As time goes by, that's going to be more and more unheard of. One of the reasons, as you know, Bob, that people start to work for the city is not because of the great salaries, but
Right.
the most essential thing is their health insurance.
Right.
But I want to ask your opinion on it. I'm sure you're aware that City Hall has unilaterally decided to take our civil rights away, the right to quality health insurance, and is putting us in a very dangerous situation. The major hospitals, two of which I know of officially through my contacts, are not going to participate in this Medicare Advantage program, which is really a disadvantage program. It's an HMO disguised as something else. Bob, what is your opinion on this?
So, right. I've spent a lot of time on this because it is a signature issue and it's a national issue.
Yes.
Work Bites is committed, and so is my radio program, to creating a platform for the 250,000 retired civil servants. By way of background, I just need to do a little bit of this is stuff, your lived experience, but for the record, and because hopefully people will tune into this who aren't on the call now, the seeds for this were set during Michael Bloomberg's tenure. And so for several years, he made a calculated decision to not sign or reach contract deals with the city's unions. As anyone who runs a household or responsible for a family's finances know, compound interest works for you, but it can also work against you. And so over the years, the failure to close contracts had an impact on the welfare funds, because that's the thing that supports all of it. There's a contract deal for wages and hours, and then there's the welfare funds and the various things, prescription drugs, and all that is made whole. Michael Bloomberg actually planted little IED devices in the system. And so when Mayor de Blasio came in, he had to close roughly 100 contracts in 18 months. And as a consequence, because nobody wanted to do something basic like collect the stock transfer tax we've been refunding since the 1980s to the tune of $138 billion, they didn't want to make anything uncomfortable for the corporations. They spent down the Health Stabilization Fund to fund the UFT contract. No one begrudges the teachers a contract. So that set the stage for the current moment where the unions, particularly DC 37, UFT, Teamsters 237, the wolf is at the door. Mayor Adams comes in. This had started under Mayor de Blasio. He attempted to migrate folks to Medicare Advantage, and then in the process came up with this measure that if you wanted to retain your current coverage, you could pay $191 a month, and rightfully
For that, Bob.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Marion Pizzatola, the retirement group, they went and they were successfully able in court, because that was such clearly a violation of what you would describe as deferred compensation. In essence, what people got as part of the social contract for being part of the public workforce was this deferred compensation. Now they're cashing it in to have this Medicare Advantage situation. And it's important to give people a sense of what this business model is, because there's precious little basic explanation of it. One of the things, the way it works is Medicare Advantage comes in and they manage the Medicare program. And the way that they make money is by telling CMS, which is the agency at the federal government that sends the money to cover the care. They have clinicians look at your chart and they create the worst case scenario that you're the sickest you possibly can imagine. Then you as the patient have to go through all kinds of hoops to get access through prior authorizations. And that's the VIG. That's the premium. That's what they make money on. So in essence, they're acting as a speed bump for folks who need care. Now, where this gets really bad is for the several thousand, and there are that many, civil servants who did not make the first responder test for 9/11, but were ordered, because there was no Zoom in 2001, were ordered to sit at 1 Center Street and do their job, now have cancer. Some of them are terminally ill. Many of them have already died. And so they have a very fragile healthcare architecture and so it's been working. And the one thing that I want to do is has it thrown up in the air with this Wall Street driven financialization of something that was created by unions for all of America. And now, unfortunately, certain unions are selling out.
It's despicable, and it's really a violation of our civil rights, the right to life and liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because if you don't have your health, and if you don't have access to the top hospitals and top physicians, you don't have a chance. And finally, you said clinicians, look at the charts, or they, make decisions, right. These things. I read articles from, a bona fide, verified articles, which indicate that they even use bots to
AI. Right.
AI. Okay. So a machine is looking at your, what you have and so on and so forth, and they're making decisions. I believe, Bob, that you're such a great voice for labor in this city, or, in this nation, really. This is going to set a standard. It's not just about the retirees who are going to be afflicted by it, but this mayor, City Hall, is setting a standard to take away the rights of these union workers, take it away. And what's going to happen in the future? It's going to be the program for the rank and file also. Once you give City Hall an inch, they're going to take a foot. They will do it. And other cities and other states look to New York. Basically, they look to New York and California for making decisions and so on. And it's going to go across the country. It's going to be the end of really all the rights that workers need to have. I think it's a catastrophe, and it is a crime.
So I wanted to say one thing that's important. I think it brings to the fore the problem. This country is very reluctant to the people in power. Every time it's been suggested in the Senate to have an after action report like the 9/11 Commission. And I might say you and Glenn, to just give so much props to you, which you deserve, really use that process of looking back to create a whole important conversation about skyscraper safety. And so it's possible, when there's a mass tragedy like that, to use it as a platform to galvanize a better day, and to visualize an alternative that puts people first and elevates people. And so notice though, that we, for whatever reason, don't have the stomach yet to do this about this pandemic. And so we have President Biden in his bomber jacker moment with the aviators saying on May 11th, the pandemic's over. And as we speak right now, we have no idea how many essential first responders pass as a consequence of their occupational exposure. And why that matters is that we need to know what were the pathways. How can we reduce this? Because this is happening again. We know from all the expert evaluation of this, it's not a question of if, but when. And so we owe it to all these people when, the idea of not forgetting and remembering applies to COVID as well. Because these people that in those first several months, without sufficient PPE, without vaccine, who went out to keep the world working and moving, we owe it to them to remember them for their sacrifice, but we owe it to society and the future generations to hold ourselves accountable for how singularly unprepared we were.
Well, no one was held accountable or responsible for any of the failures of 9/11, to the police, to the firefighters, to
Fire
the
radios, it's a long list.
No, they got away with that. So 9/11 set a standard for governments, whatever, to get away with murder. And, the good thing was that because of your articles and because of Glenn and Charles and Vinnie Dunn gave me personally a validity, because uniformed services aren't really used to listening to a young Proby's mother, but because of Vinnie Dunn and you great people, and Norman, who said to me, even firefighters have civil rights, and that's why he championed our organization and our initiatives. Okay, and I don't know if you know this. It's very interesting. Norman Siegel's brother was a firefighter on the FDNY for over 20
I did not know that.
Very low key. I met him, and the last time I saw him, I believe they were retired in Florida. One last thing I want to say. City Hall is first attacking the weakest group being senior citizens who are retired, who are scattered all over this country, who aren't necessarily living in New York City, but they're going to be affected. And you start with them, and then you go for all the other unions and all the other employees. So this is an atrocity, and it is going to be a disaster for people who don't have access to the proper medical care through dealing with a bot for your survival.
Well, I would say that one of the things, though, as what this brings to a focus is the problem that we have, and I have done a lot of research on this. One of the things that is coming out is the linkage between the elevated death toll in the United States. So it's important to know that we're 4% of the world's population and 12% of the COVID deaths. And that in the initial mapping that's been done, what is clear is that the zip codes where access to healthcare was a problem, where people didn't have access, is where the death toll was highest. Why that matters is when a disease gets traction in a community, it then becomes a threat to the entirety of the country, irrespective of your status of zip code. Do you live in a gated community or not? And so this is really kind of like a lesson out of the New Testament, right? In the sense that the fate of our own health is intimately tied to our neighbors, irrespective of race, gender, class. And so the problem is, this begs the question, is it time to have universal health care? And I know it's a longer discussion, but one of the saddest things is for EMS, it's been exposed, this country's fractured EMS system, where it's not required, by the way, in state law that you have an EMS squad. And so you have some parts of the country where it's voluntary, some places where it's a minimum wage, other places it's civil service. And this is one of the institutions that was seriously fractured by COVID. And there were hundreds of deaths of EMTs. And so it's kind of like the country's moving on. But I do think that this needs to be part of a broad national discussion of professionalizing with dignity this essential work. And I think that as long as you have a corridor community that is one bad rail bearing away from Bhopal, we need to have professional firefighters and EMS on the other side of that disaster.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That was a great issue. Sally, thank you for raising that. And it's a huge one. In our remaining time here,
Sure.
We've got a couple of big picture items. And while we're talking about EMS, one of the persistent issues that we've had to deal with in New York City is this, frankly, second-class status of FDNY EMS. Now I know
Right.
you point out, rightly so, that EMS is delivered by multiple agencies,
Right.
which I honestly think half the city council probably doesn't know that, but that's another.
Right.
We don't have time to bash the city
Right.
council
Right.
right now, so we'll have to do a follow up for that. But why is it? Well, I know some of it. Why is it? I mean, there's absolutely zero labor solidarity between the firefighters and the EMS and the fire inspectors. But this workforce, as you point out, bore the brunt of COVID, heavier workload, terrible working conditions, really critical work, and yet everybody talks about, oh yes, you should get more pay, but they never seem to be able to pull that off.
So I would say that there's a little bit of daylight, because one of the perverse incentives in the system is that if you're 3 years on EMS, you can get promoted by taking a test to get in the fire department. So what's happened now is that there are some firefighters and fire officers who came up that way. And so there's Charles, there's a willingness or an understanding. It hasn't percolated to the top of the executive board of the unions, but there's some shared experience. It's not like they don't know, like when the city was first, when Giuliani made the decision, which I think was a corrupt one, to break off EMS from the hospital system. So let's do a quick reprise of that, because that laid the foundation for some of the problems, right? So Giuliani comes in, he decides he's involved, he's in bed with some of these private hospital private ambulance characters. And of course, the political economy, again, there's that word. He decides to pull EMS out of Health and Hospitals Corporation and give it to the fire department. And it's not an accident that at that time, structural fires were declining. The FDNY did need an enhanced mission. And so that became the rules of the road. Now, there is a plantation system, and I'll say that's what it is, because even after this last contract settlement, which did make some progress, we're still in a situation where your starting pay is tens of thousands of dollars different than a firefighter. And so what's happened is they've built in an incentive to use those first 3 years as a stepping stone to get to the fire department, where, by the way, you enjoy unlimited sick. Whereas if you're an EMT, it's 13 days. How does that make sense? People that are the front lines of infectious disease, for you, we're going to be finite with sick time. Firefighter, unlimited sick. That's just one example of what is a plantation system. Now, as Yetta Carlin, my friend, labor lawyer, and representative of 2507 and 3621 on this matter, points out, this is also the fact that the EMS job title is primarily filled by women and people of color. And so the other aspect of this that needs to be considered, the building inspectors have a similar case going forward, because when you compare their salary as peace officers, hear me? They're peace officers. So they're a step up in the civil service hierarchy as law enforcement, and they're making less than building inspectors. And so we do have this system that also, what it does do is it promotes people leaving EMS. That's bad for people that are in the public, because all the literature tells us it takes at least 6 years to get that level of competency to deal with cardiac arrest in the field. There's a survival rate much higher for people when you're ministered to by somebody who's had some years under their belt. And so now they created this churn effect where it's not a career. Now, I would say to you that back in the day with Health and Hospitals, what was lighted about that approach is, if you wanted a career in medicine, and there was a number of ER docs around, and you're a working class stiff who may not have access to money to go to med school, you could ride a rig in the city you love, get the chops together, go to school, and become a doctor. That path is not the same today.
Okay. And what politically, what legally is the impediment? Because there's certain people on the council who get away with running around, quote unquote championing EMS, and then it goes on over years and nothing ever happens.
So this has to do with back during the Bloomberg era, the city council did formally pass the uniform designation for EMS.
Right.
And Bloomberg just decided that he wasn't going to abide by that. And so subsequent administrations have pretty much followed along with that. And so, I mean, one of the things that's just crazy is a newer, more modern places like west of the Mississippi, and in some parts of newer places in America, like say ones that were founded after the Second World War, municipalities, you'll see the EMS and fire function merge together. And so there's some talk that that's actually a healthier job, where you spend 2 weeks riding a rig, healing people, and 2 weeks dealing with the fire. We have not done that here. We've not integrated those services. And I also think that the EMS folks were done at disadvantage because there was this perception, and even shared by Mayor de Blasio, who said to me in answer to a question when I asked him about this lack of parity, he said, well, EMS work is different. So I don't know what it is, some holdover idea that they don't go charging it to burning buildings or whatever. But I would have thought during the pandemic where they did pay such a heavy price, that this would have been something that would have become politically apparent. But you're right. They do run out the clock. One example of kind of like scofflaw behavior, the EMS unions successfully got a law passed in Albany requiring upper level EMS captains, deputy captains to have a civil service test, because up to now that's been political appointees. And the Adams administration and their DCAS person has just decided, well, we're not going to follow that. So a lot of it has to do with the importance of EMS getting the word out. And that's another reason why programs like my show, I would even say the city paper, got to give them some props. They've done some good labor reporting. My colleagues at the Gothamist. I mean, we are seeing more labor reporting, but we've got to hold these outlets accountable.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. And I think the consensus, and I see it, around the country, is that EMS is no pun intended, on life support. It's just a dysfunctional system. The funding streams are not there. There's a human resource crisis, and it's just for these same dynamics playing out.
Can I give you the Bob Hennelly 2 Steps to Fix America?
Well, yeah, just sure.
Okay, sure. No charge.
Let me get my notebook ready.
Yeah, no. So, but just one of the things when you investigate the fire service, you understand that one of the things that works for promoting fire departments is our casualty insurance business. And so throughout the country, insurance companies determine their premiums they charge you for insuring your factory, insuring your condo, whatever, based on the robustness of your local response time. If this country was serious about healthcare, they would do a similar thing with linking EMS to our healthcare system. And so while I know people get very nervous about something like universal healthcare, and they like the fact the United States spends the most in the world on healthcare with the poorest results, there's something to be proud of. So if we can't get around universal care because the pharma and the insurance companies own our politicians, let's start with universal EMS. That is that if you're in your last moments before you meet your maker, we guarantee you'll be picked up by a qualified and well-paid and well-trained emergency medical technician. What do you think? Can we get our arms around that?
It seems non-controversial, but yes, and absolutely, that's a good point. And I'll the fire insurance industry is interested in property insurance, and in the insurance industry, property and life insurance are separate businesses. Right. And so,
because we value property, don't want to get too in my, but this is the thing, like property is important. Casualty, who is the casualty?
Well, and it's insured, right? If you don't have life insurance, I mean, not to, but the insurance industry is indifferent to whether
Right.
you live or die if you don't have a policy, right?
Right, exactly. They
I mean,
prefer
that's the
you die,
reality of it.
actually, they can keep the premium.
Yeah, well, so, all right, now, last thing we
Yeah.
want to do, let's come back to where we started, kind of,
Sure.
which was Twin Parks. And Twin Parks has been singularly frustrating for me because, as somebody who keeps an eye on high-rise fire
Right.
safety issues, we always think, well, the next one we're going to get, and we're following up on
Right.
the supposed progressive turn
Right.
of the de Blasio administration.
Right.
And I'll just leave it at that. But you have Twin Parks, you have this calamity. And yet, and then there's this action to form this task force, this city, citywide task force on fire, Twin Parks citywide task force on fire prevention, which had a hearing in April of last year and basically increased fines for self-closing doors. And as far as I can tell, I have a call in to one of the co-chairs. I've corresponded with them. We had a seminar with one of their staffers early on when we were fairly optimistic about what might happen. And it just goes on and on, but I don't know what other way to say it. Not a damn thing has happened. There's never been any substantive proposal for fire alarms, public address systems, heaven forbid sprinklers. And we look around the country, Chicago
Right.
undertook a regulatory regime and high-rise residentials. We just had this action in Minneapolis. They had a fire in a public housing. They killed 4 people. It shocked the state so severely that the Senate delegation, the 2 senators, jumped on board with federal funding to put sprinklers retroactively into all public housing. Why is it that there seems to be such indifference to this issue here in New York, aside from, if you want to be just crass, that it's the tentacles of the real estate industry, around our politicians.
So I think this, it's funny because I pulled an article I did about the Grenfell fire, which is so instructive because that was a case where, and that was in London. Was it London?
Yes, it was London.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so catastrophic loss of life, much hand-wringing. Another example of where the public articulated the exposure and the problem, and no one listened. And so this becomes a political question, the ability to hold people accountable. I had a similar waking nightmare. I'll give it after the Deutsche Bank building. So I was working for WNOC covering the redevelopment of the World Trade Center, which had all kinds of integrity monitors. They were making a fortune. Ex-prosecutors keeping an eye on the organized crime demolition. Oh, we got your back. And so the crazy idea that they were trying to deconstruct the Deutsche Bank building at the same time as decontaminating it. Anybody who's done anything knows that, well, if you're going to create a negative air pressure with plywood and heavy plastic to create containment for asbestos abatement, you don't want to have a acetylene torch on top of it, cutting the steel from the place you just decontaminated. You might have a problem because the arc of the sparks coming down might set a fire. But then, I'm not a professional. When that was happening and the city was hell-bent to take that building down no matter what, the residents of Community Board 1 went to the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation and said, you have nefarious actors that are getting the contract that have been debarred by the Department of Investigations taking apart that building. This was before the Deutsche Bank fire. When that same company went in and cut the standpipe and set the stage for that catastrophic event, 150 firefighters killed, 2 Graffinino and other firefighter.
150 injured.
Right. So what I'm saying is, like, the problem is we need to make sure that we support media that reports that when it happens, and then when the public turns out to be right, holds elected officials accountable for not taking action. So I will make a commitment to you that Work Bites will do such a story on the anniversary, and we will have a checklist, and we will hold them accountable to see what exactly they've accomplished. We have a deal. You help me with that?
I'll be happy to help you with that. I went so far. We had an author, Peter Apps, who did I think one of the best books about Grenfell.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's called
I'd
Show
love
Me
to
the
have his-
Bodies. I'll send you a link, but we have a
Yeah.
nice interview with him. But I actually went so far as I mailed a copy of the book to each of the co-chairs of that committee.
Oh, wow.
And of course, I've not heard from them. But it's pretty, it's like you get to a certain stage and it's like, well, how many more of these are we going to have? And is this going to be how I'm going to go out of the game?
I will
The
say
same
to you
spot I was in and I started in the 80s,
Right. The other thing about this is that we do have this kind of another example was that horrendous Queens fire in the child care center.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I regularly monitor what's going on, and so I saw, there's like one little kid was seriously hurt. There were 13 or so. It was a lithium battery. It was a location, an illegal daycare center that was co-located with a dental lab. And I thought, I put some time in, told Joe Maniscalco I'm going to go big on this. And I thought the city would be, well, let's take an inventory about the status of illegal daycare centers. Crickets. Because nobody wants to upset the apple cart. And so they're waiting for the next tragedy to clutch the pearls.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, okay. I was trying to end on there is no high note here, but I think with our pledge to keep fighting is probably as good as any. And I want to thank the audience, and we will have this up online. And I know if you get a link to it, I did put into the chat a link to a YouTube video. You made the point, and I don't know if you've been exposed to the work of the Wallaces, Roderick and Deborah.
No.
But the exact point you made about public health and really COVID, they documented COVID basically took hold in the Bronx before it took off nationally. It started on the West Coast,
right,
the East Coast, and the Bronx. And they make exactly that point that, you cannot ignore certain communities, and those public health issues will fester and they will spread out. Or as a politician, a colorful politician, African-American woman, pioneer down in Orange County, Florida, Mabel Butler. In the late 80s, I did a project down there, and she was pretty colorful. And she had a great statement, which I think still resonates. Said, mosquitoes may breed in my district, but they bite asses all over the county. Meaning that, I can't
top that.
No, that's pretty much
great,
sums
Joe.
it up. So that's probably worthy of a PhD in public health, but but there you have it. So Bob, I want to thank you again.
Thank you.
This has been great. I want to give everybody a plug for the book, Stuck Nation. It's available if you go to Bob's website. I did send the link out. Quite affordable. And as I said, the WBAI show, what's going on 7:00 on Tuesdays?
Mondays. And Mondays. It lives on the Work Bites website.
Yes. And
also
then on Work Bites.
My Twitter handle is @StuckNation, because as we've discussed, we surely are.
Oh, well, there you go. All right. Thank you very much, Bob.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.